She didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She didn't give them the satisfaction of a single visible tear. She just stood there, in the middle of Blackstone Cathedral, surrounded by 1,000 wolves in their finest clothes, and watched the man she loved extend his hand to her sister. The ancient words rang out across the stone hall. Binding words. Irreversible words. And in the space between one heartbeat and the next, Mary Craig understood that everything she had believed about her life, her love, and her future had been a story someone else was telling about her. And the story had just ended. But here is what no one in that cathedral knew. What even he didn't know. She was already carrying his children. The morning of the choosing ceremony, Mary woke before dawn. She lay still for a long time in the narrow bed of her family's townhouse on Lafayette Street, listening to Detroit breathe in the dark. The distant moan of a freight barge on the river, the wind scraping bare oak branches against the window glass, the occasional wail of a siren moving through Midtown like a ghost. The city had always felt alive to her in ways that most people couldn't explain, and she had never tried to. Detroit was a wolf city in its bones. Even the humans who lived here felt it without knowing what it was. That low, thrumming undercurrent of something ancient and barely leashed, running beneath the streets like a second river. She pressed one hand flat against her stomach beneath the covers and held it there. 8 weeks. The pack healer, old Dr. Reyes, had confirmed it 3 days ago in his basement clinic on Gresham Avenue, speaking in a near whisper even though they were alone, even though the compulsion he'd placed on himself and on her would prevent either of them from speaking of it to anyone unauthorized. He had looked at her over the rims of his reading glasses with an expression she could not entirely decode. Something caught between professional gravity and a very old, very deep pity. Twins, he had said. Alpha-blooded, both of them. You can feel it already, can't you? The double pull. She could. She had been feeling it for weeks without understanding what it was. A warmth in her core that doubled back on itself, like two small flames sharing the same wick. She had thought it was the bond strengthening. She had thought it was Spencer. She had planned to tell him tonight. She had rehearsed the words 40 times over the past 72 hours, lying in this same bed, staring at this same water-stained ceiling. Spencer, I need to tell you something before tomorrow. Something that changes everything. Something that I hope, changes everything in the right direction. She had imagined his face doing that thing it sometimes did when she surprised him. That brief fracture in the careful, controlled expression he wore like armor. The flash of something unguarded and young and real beneath all the kingship. She had imagined his hands coming up to cup her face. She had imagined the exhale of relief, of wonder, of a man who has been carrying the world discovering, suddenly, that the world has given him something back. She had not imagined Vivian, which was, in retrospect, her first and most catastrophic failure of imagination. She rose at 6 and dressed carefully. The green velvet gown had been her mother's, deep forest green, shot through with threads of gold that caught light like embers, cut in the old ceremonial style with a high waist and long, draping sleeves that moved like water. It had been altered twice in the last decade. Once when her mother passed it down, and once, quietly, 3 weeks ago, when Mary had noticed the waistline beginning to strain. The seamstress had let the seams out with the practiced neutrality of a woman who had seen everything and said nothing about any of it. Mary stood before the bathroom mirror and swept her auburn hair back, pinning it with her grandmother's silver comb. The face that looked back at her was not the face of a woman who had slept well. There were shadows beneath her green eyes that foundation only partially concealed, and a tension in her jaw that she consciously, deliberately relaxed. Once, twice, 3 times, breathing through her nose the way Spencer had taught her during the consolidation years, when the threat of war had made everyone's shoulders climb toward their ears and stay there. Breathe. You are a wolf. Wolves do not show fear to the pack. She had told herself this so many times over the past 3 years that it had lost all specific meaning and become something more like a mantra, a rhythmic, repetitive incantation that kept the deeper chaos at bay through sheer force of repetition. Breathe. You are a wolf. Breathe. You are a wolf. Today it felt less effective than usual. She picked up her phone from the nightstand. No messages from Spencer. This was not unusual. He rarely texted on ceremony days, when his schedule was consumed by advisors and security briefings and the endless logistics of moving an alpha king through a public space without getting him killed. She had not expected a message. She told herself she had not expected a message. She put the phone back down and went downstairs to eat something, because the healer had told her she needed to eat something, and because the small new lives inside her required fuel even when their mother's stomach had knotted itself into a shape that made eating feel like an act of violence. The cathedral was a 40-minute drive through the gray December morning, past the ice-edged riverfront, and up through Midtown's Art Deco canyons, through the quiet streets of New Center where the old automotive money had once built limestone mansions, now converted to pack administrative offices and ceremonial halls. Her cousin Petra drove, talking about nothing in particular. The traffic, the weather, the sheer spectacle of how Blackstone Cathedral had been decorated this year. And Mary sat in the passenger seat and watched Detroit slide past the window and tried to memorize the feeling of the morning before it became afternoon. She was aware, in the way that people sometimes are aware of things they are not consciously allowing themselves to know, that something was wrong. She had felt it since waking, a hollowness beneath the warmth of the pregnancy, a vibration in the bond that was not the comfortable, low-frequency hum of he is near, but something more dissonant, more complex. A chord played in a key she didn't recognize. She had told herself it was nerves. She had told herself it was the pregnancy hormones, which Dr. Reyes had warned her would make everything feel more extreme, more raw, more immediate. She had told herself many things during the 40-minute drive, and none of them had been the truth. And some part of her had known they weren't the truth. And she had chosen them anyway because the alternative, the actual truth, the truth her wolf sense was trying to push through the wall of her careful denial, was not something she was willing to hold in her hands before she had to. She would hold it when she had to. She held it at 10:47 in the morning, standing in the north transept of Blackstone Cathedral, when she saw her sister standing at the altar's edge. Let me be precise about what Mary saw, because precision matters here. It matters because the difference between Vivian standing near the altar and Vivian positioned as a candidate is a difference of about 6 inches of floor space and 100% of a woman's entire understanding of her own life. Vivian Craig was 24 years old that morning, 3 years younger than Mary, and she was wearing crimson and gold. Her platinum hair, the hair that had always seemed to belong to a different, more expensive family than the one they'd grown up in together, was braided and coiled and pinned with a cascade of seed pearls that caught the cathedral's candlelight and threw it back in small, bright explosions. She was standing not among the Craig family grouping, not among the invited guests in their assigned sections, but at the front of the hall, separated from the crowd by the low stone balustrade that designated the candidate's space. The candidate's space. The space where, according to 700 years of choosing ceremony tradition, only women who had been formally presented as potential lunas were permitted to stand. Mary looked at her sister standing in that space, and she felt the bottom of the world open up. She did not move. She did not make a sound. The cathedral noise continued around her, the rustle of expensive fabric, the low tide of whispered conversation, the occasional sharp bark of a child being hushed by a parent, and none of it penetrated the sudden, total silence that had descended over her entire nervous system like a hand pressed flat over a ringing bell. She knew. That was the thought that arrived first, before grief, before rage, before anything else that would come later. Vivian knew. She has known. She has been planning this. The accumulated small moments of the past 6 weeks rearranged themselves in Mary's memory with a terrible, crystalline clarity. Vivian's new habit of leaving rooms when Mary entered them, Vivian's careful questions about Spencer's schedule and preferences disguised as sisterly small talk, Vivian's single comment, delivered lightly, almost carelessly, over dinner 3 weeks ago, that perhaps Mary was too comfortable assuming things that hadn't been formally confirmed. Mary had told herself it was Vivian being Vivian. Provocative. Competitive in that low level, ambient way she had always been competitive since childhood. The way younger siblings sometimes were with older ones. She had chosen not to press it. She had chosen so many wrong things. Welcome back to the channel, my dear friends. Before we jump further into the story, please take a moment to subscribe, give this video a like, and tell me in the comments which country you're watching from. Your support means the world to me and helps me bring you even more exciting stories. Believe me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now let's dive into the story. Spencer Harrison entered the cathedral at 11 o'clock exactly. Even now, even standing in the ruins of everything she had believed about them, Mary felt it. The pull. The bone-deep recognition that was not optional, not chosen, not something she could turn off by understanding how thoroughly she had been betrayed. It moved through her like a current the moment he crossed the threshold, that wolf-deep certainty. There he is. There is the one. 7 years of loving him had written it into her biology at a level beneath conscious thought. And it did not care what was happening at the altar's edge. And it did not care what his eyes would do in the next 60 seconds. And it did not care about anything at all except the raw, animal fact of his presence in the same room as her heartbeat. She hated it. In that moment, she hated it more than she had ever hated anything. He walked the length of the aisle in ceremonial blacks, jacket and trousers in matte charcoal, the Alpha King's sigil picked out in silver thread at his collar and cuffs. No crown because Alpha Kings did not wear crowns at the choosing, because the choosing itself was the crown, the Luna's acceptance the only coronation that mattered in this tradition. He was 31 years old, and he looked it in the way that men who have been through genuine fire look their ages. Not worn exactly, but marked, the planes of his face settled into something harder and more permanent than the boy she had known. The jaw more defined, the eyes darker and more carefully guarded. Those eyes swept the assembly as he walked. She watched them move across the crowd, the calculated, automatic survey of a man who had spent 3 years learning to read rooms for threats. And she watched the precise moment they found her face. It was a fraction of a second. Less. A micro-expression so small and so quickly extinguished that no one else in the cathedral would have caught it. But Mary caught it. She caught the flash of something that was not calculation, and not ceremony, and not the controlled, performing version of Spencer Harrison that the pack world got to see. She caught the brief, involuntary flinch. Not physical, but something happening behind his eyes, something that looked almost like pain. And then she watched him shut it down, wall it off, bury it beneath the stone face of the Alpha King, and turn away from her. Turn to Vivian. Extend his hand. I, Spencer Aldrich Harrison, Alpha King of the Great Lakes Territory, by the right of blood and bond, by the ancient compact of wolf and moon. The ceremonial words fell across the cathedral like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples that Mary felt in her chest, in her throat, in the place just below her sternum where the bond had lived for 7 years and was now, she understood, dying in real time. Not metaphorically dying. Actually dying. She could feel it contracting, pulling back, the warm, constant presence of Spencer in the bond flickering and guttering like a candle in a draft. She pressed one hand against her stomach. The small, involuntary gesture of a woman protecting something. She did it without deciding to do it, her palm flat against the drape of green velvet, and she felt, through the chaos and the grief and the cathedral noise and the dying bond, the answering double warmth of the 2 small lives who knew nothing about ceremonies and political alliances and sisters who smiled while they destroyed you, who knew only the warmth of their mother's body and the rhythmic percussion of her heart. I have to go, she thought. Not as a plan. Not yet as anything so organized as a plan. Just as an absolute animal truth. I have to go right now before anyone looks at my face. She turned and walked out of the cathedral. She did not look at Vivian. She did not look at Spencer. She did not look at the assembled nobility of every pack in the Great Lakes Territory, who would be watching her, would be already watching her, the wolves who had come to this ceremony knowing what everyone knew, what had been understood for years in the circles of pack society, that Mary Craig was the woman Spencer Harrison had loved since childhood and would choose today. They would see her leaving. They would understand what it meant. And then they would do what wolves in fine clothing always do. They would talk and speculate, and some of them would pity her, and some of them would be quietly delighted by her humiliation. And all of it was information she would use later. But first she had to get out of the building before the tears came, because wolves fed on visible wounds, and she would not give them that. She walked through the cathedral's side door into the December cold. The Detroit winter hit her like a wall, sharp and clean and mercilessly real after the incense-thick air of the ceremony hall. She walked down the stone steps and across the empty side courtyard and through the iron gate onto the street, and she kept walking, and behind her the ancient words finished falling, and the crowd erupted in sound, and somewhere inside Blackstone Cathedral, Vivian Craig became the Luna of the Great Lakes Territory. And the Detroit winter closed around Mary like a fist, and she did not stop walking. Not yet. Not until she'd put enough distance between herself and everything she had believed her life would be. But even as she walked, even as the first tears finally came, private and furious in the frozen air. She was already thinking, already calculating, already becoming, in the space of a single devastated mile, something harder and more dangerous than the woman who had entered that cathedral an hour ago. She had 2 lives to protect now. 2 lives that the new queen of the Great Lakes territory would consider threats to the succession the moment she learned of their existence. And Vivian, Mary knew with absolute certainty, would learn of it. Which meant Mary had exactly one priority now, and it had nothing to do with love or betrayal or the bond flickering out in her chest like a dying signal. It had to do with survival. She touched her stomach once more as she turned off Lafayette Street into the maze of Eastern Market's back alleys. And she made her children a promise. No one will find us. No one will use you. I am going to disappear so completely that even the wolves will forget I existed. And then, when the time is right, we're going to make them remember. That was the moment the real story began. Not in the cathedral. Not with the ceremony. But here, in the cold, with nothing but a green dress and a burner phone number she'd memorized 6 months ago for reasons she'd told herself she would never need. She was wrong about a lot of things that year. She was not wrong about this. What would you have done in Mary's position? Walked away in silence, or stayed and forced the confrontation? Drop your answer in the comments. Sometimes the hardest kind of strength is the kind nobody gets to witness. The burner phone number belonged to a woman named Cora Vasquez, and Mary had memorized it the way you memorize an emergency exit route. Not because you plan to use it, but because some quiet, practical part of your brain insists on knowing where the doors are. She had met Cora 14 months ago at a grief support gathering in a Corktown community center. One of those low-lit, folding chair circles that existed in Detroit's in-between spaces, serving the city's population of rogue wolves and half-bloods and pack-adjacent humans who had nowhere else to bring their particular flavors of loss. Mary had gone with a client, a young woman from the east side whose mate had been killed in the border skirmishes and who had needed a hand to hold in the dark. Cora had been running the circle that night, compact and watchful, maybe 45, with close-cropped silver hair and the steady, unhurried manner of someone who had survived things she never talked about and had built her entire subsequent life on the foundation of that survival. After the circle, while the folding chairs were being stacked and the coffee urns rinsed, Cora had pressed a small card into Mary's hand. No name on it, just a number. In case you ever need a door, she had said quietly, and moved away before Mary could ask what she meant. Mary had kept the card for 11 months. Then she had memorized the number and burned the card in her kitchen sink, because keeping it felt like tempting something she wasn't ready to name. Now, walking east on Gresham Avenue with the December wind at her back and the cathedral's bells fading behind her, she was ready to name it. She found a payphone, one of the last ones in Detroit, an artifact that had survived the smartphone era through sheer municipal neglect, outside a 24-hour laundromat on the corner of Gresham and St. Aubin. She fed it quarters from the small emergency roll she kept in the inner pocket of her coat, a habit Spencer had instilled in her during the consolidation years when he had insisted that everyone in his inner circle carry analog backup options. Digital can be traced. Digital can be jammed. Quarters cannot. She had thought it was paranoia at the time. She thought about that now with a specific caustic bitterness that she allowed herself for exactly 10 seconds before setting it aside. There was no space for bitterness right now. Bitterness was a luxury she would earn back later. The phone rang twice. Who is this? Cora's voice. Flat, careful, fully awake despite the early hour. You gave me a card 14 months ago, Mary said. Corktown Community Center. I was with a young woman who had lost her mate. A pause. Brief but real. I remember you, Cora said. Auburn hair. Green eyes. You held her hand for 3 hours without saying a word. Yes. Are you in danger right now? Immediate danger? Mary thought about this honestly, because Cora's voice was the voice of someone who needed honest answers, not reassuring ones. She thought about Vivian, who was at this moment standing at an altar receiving the bond words of the Alpha King. She thought about how quickly information moved through pack networks. She thought about how Vivian had always been meticulous, thorough, several moves ahead of everyone who underestimated her. Not immediate, she said. But I have a window. Maybe 6 hours before it closes. Where are you? Gresham and Street Aubin. There's a laundromat. Go inside. Order a coffee from the machine if they have one. Don't use your phone, any phone after this call. I'll have someone there in 20 minutes. The line went dead. Mary hung up the payphone and went inside the laundromat. It smelled of warm lint and industrial detergent and the particular human exhaustion of a Saturday morning, and there were 3 people in it. An elderly man reading a newspaper, a young mother folding children's clothes with the focused efficiency of someone who had 100 other things to do, a teenager asleep across 2 plastic chairs with a backpack as a pillow. None of them were wolves. None of them looked up. Mary found the coffee machine, fed it $1 in quarters, and stood with the paper cup warming her hands while outside the laundromat windows Detroit went about its Saturday morning, oblivious to the fact that somewhere in Blackstone Cathedral, the world had just changed. She allowed herself, in those 20 minutes of waiting, to feel it. Not all of it. Not the full, devastating weight of 7 years ending in 60 seconds of ceremony words. She didn't have the time or the structural capacity for that. Not here, not now, not with 2 small lives depending on her ability to function. But she allowed herself the outline of it, the shape of the loss. She let it move through her once, like a wave she stood in rather than ran from, feeling it crest and break and recede and leave the sand rearranged. Spencer had chosen Vivian. Spencer had known, at some point before this morning, that he was going to choose Vivian, which meant he had known for days, possibly weeks, and he had not told her. Had looked at her in the ways he looked at her, had spoken to her in the ways he spoke to her, had allowed her to carry the certainty of their bond like a gift she was about to receive. And he had known it was not coming. She pressed her palm flat against her stomach through the velvet and the coat. He did not know about the twins. That single fact was the only lever she had, and she would not use it as a lever. She would use it as a reason to disappear so completely that he never had the opportunity to turn her children into political complications, succession threats, problems to be managed by a queen who had already demonstrated that she managed problems with absolute efficiency. The door of the laundromat opened. A young man came in, mid-20s, stocky, wearing a delivery company jacket that was too thin for the weather. He glanced around the space, his eyes moving with the particular calibration of a wolf doing a threat assessment, and landed on Mary. He crossed to her without preamble. "Cora sent me," he said quietly. "My name is Tomas. I have a car outside. We need to move." Mary set down the paper cup and followed him out into the cold. Cora's operation was based out of a converted auto parts warehouse in the Eastern Market District. 4 blocks from the famous weekend market stalls, hidden in plain sight behind a legitimate salvage business that bought and sold vintage car components and employed 6 human workers who had no idea what the building's lower level contained. The lower level contained, among other things, a medical base staffed by 2 healers who had left PAC service under various circumstances and now worked off-grid. A documentation workshop capable of producing identification that would survive most supernatural scrutiny. A network of safe houses distributed across Detroit, Hamtramck, Highland Park, and 3 locations in Windsor, Ontario across the river. And Cora Vasquez herself, sitting at a scarred wooden table with a mug of coffee and the unhurried attention of someone whose entire professional existence was built around people arriving at her door with 6-hour windows and complicated problems. She looked at Mary for a long moment after Tomas had left them alone in the table room. "How far along?" she said. Mary blinked. "How did you? The way you walked in. The way you held yourself in the car. I've seen it before." Cora wrapped both hands around her mug. "How far along?" 8 weeks. Twins." Mary sat down across from her. "Alpha-blooded." Cora was quiet for a moment. Something moved through her expression that was not quite surprise and not quite the deep, practiced neutrality she usually wore. Something more human and more complicated. "Whose?" she said. Then immediately, "Forgive me. That's not my business." "It is your business," Mary said, "because it determines the level of threat. They're Spencer Harrison's." The silence that followed was the loudest Mary had heard all morning, which was saying something. Cora set down her mug. "The Alpha King." "Yes." "Who, as of approximately," she checked her watch, 40 minutes ago completed his choosing ceremony. "Yes." "He doesn't know." "No. I was going to tell him last night. I had the words planned. But he had already made the decision by then, and she stopped. Reset. He doesn't know. And the woman he chose this morning, Vivian, is my sister. And she is thorough, and she is intelligent, And the moment she learns there are alpha-blooded heirs in existence who are not hers, she will move to eliminate the problem. Cora looked at her steadily. And you believe she will learn? She already knows I was pregnant. The certainty of it settled over Mary as she said the words aloud, the last piece of the pattern clicking into place. Vivian's comment 3 weeks ago. Her precise, careful distancing. The way she had stopped asking about Spencer, as though she'd already obtained all the information she needed. I think she had me watched. I think she knows about the healer appointment. I think she's been building the case for months. Cora nodded slowly. Not the nod of someone being told something they don't believe. The nod of someone calibrating a threat level they had already provisionally assessed. Then we have less than 6 hours, she said. We have maybe 2. What followed was the most efficient 2 hours of Mary's life. Cora's documentation team produced a new identity. Not built from scratch, which would take days, but pulled from a prepared shelf of partial identities that Cora maintained for exactly these circumstances, to be customized and completed as needed. Mary Craig became Nora Ellison, originally of Traverse City, currently between addresses, no known PAC affiliation. Driver's license, social security card, 2 bank cards attached to a clean account containing $4,000 in emergency funds. Cora's standard resettlement package, to be repaid if and when the recipient was able, forgiven if they weren't. I'll repay it, Mary said, looking at the cards in her hand. I know you will, Cora said, in a tone that suggested she said this to everyone and had stopped attaching expectations to it. The medical healer, a quiet, precise woman named Dr. Adiz who had left the Harrison PAC service 2 years ago under circumstances she didn't discuss, examined Mary thoroughly and provided prenatal vitamins, a list of off-grid obstetric contacts in 3 cities, and a 30-minute briefing on what to watch for in an alpha-blooded twin pregnancy that would distinguish normal discomfort from warning signs requiring intervention. You need to eat, Dr. Adiz said, in the tone of someone delivering a medical directive, not a suggestion. Consistently and substantially. Twin alpha pregnancies make demands on the mother's system that are significantly higher than standard PAC pregnancies. Your wolf metabolism will accelerate. If you underfuel it, the consequences come fast. Understood, Mary said. And you need to stay calm. I mean that physiologically, not as platitude. Sustained cortisol elevation at this stage is. I know, Mary said. I know what it is. I'll manage it. Dr. Adiz looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a medical professional who doubts a patient's self-assessment but recognizes the moment when pushing the point would be counterproductive. She nodded and handed over a paper bag containing the vitamins, some food, and a printed sheet of contacts. Tomas drove Mary to the second location, a safe house in Hamtramck, in a neighborhood of neat brick bungalows and Eastern European bakeries, and the specific, close-knit density of a community that noticed strangers and maintained its own enforced privacy about what it noticed. The house was on Hanley Street, indistinguishable from its neighbors, with a small porch and heavy curtains, and a back door that opened onto a shared alley. The woman who met her at the door was perhaps 60, broad-shouldered, with iron-gray hair and the dense, anchored quality of a wolf who had made her peace with her own nature some decades ago and rearranged her entire life around that peace. Her name was Irina Kowalski, and she had been housing Cora's people for 11 years, and she had exactly 2 rules. No PAC business conducted on the property and no communication with anyone from your previous life until Cora cleared it. You'll have the back bedroom, she said, looking Mary up and down with a frank, appraising gaze of someone who had seen women arrive at this door in every possible state of damage. It has a good lock and a window that opens onto the alley if you need it. The kitchen is yours between 6 and 8 in the morning and after 7 at night. I don't ask questions. Thank you, Mary said. Irina nodded and stepped back to let her in. That first night in the Hamtramck house, Mary lay on the narrow bed in the back bedroom with the curtains pulled and the city moving quietly outside, and let herself do something she had been refusing to do all day. She let herself think about what she had lost. Not strategically. Not through the lens of threat assessment and documentation and prenatal nutrition protocols. She let herself feel the specific, irreplaceable shape of Spencer Harrison. Not the Alpha King, not the political calculation in expensive ceremonial blacks, but the Spencer she had known. The boy who had chased her through Eastern Market at 17, laughing, his dark hair wild and his eyes bright with something uncomplicated and purely joyful that had been progressively buried by the years and the weight of what he was becoming. The man who had sat with her in the dark the night his father died, not speaking, not needing to speak, his hand finding hers in the dark with the unerring precision of something more than intention. She let herself feel it. She held the loss with both hands in the dark, the way you hold something that can't be fixed, only carried. And then, after a long time, after the digital clock on the nightstand had moved from 11 to past midnight, she set it down. She pressed both hands against her stomach, and she felt the double warmth answer her. Those two small presences who were already, in whatever way 8-week lives can be present, utterly and entirely themselves. 2 heartbeats beneath her palms. 2 futures she was responsible for in a way she had never been responsible for anything before. She had run today. She had needed to run today. The window was real, the danger was real, and disappearing had been the only viable move. But she was not going to spend the next 7 months, or the next 7 years running. She was going to go to ground. She was going to deliver her children safely, in the off-grid network that Cora had built for exactly these circumstances. She was going to build a life with a new name in a city that didn't know her face. And she was going to do all of this with the cold, focused patience of a woman who understood that timing was everything, that the right move made too early was as fatal as no move at all. Vivian had won the ceremony. She had not won the war. And for the first time since walking out of Blackstone Cathedral that morning, Mary Craig, who was now Nora Ellison, who was sleeping in a safe house on Hanley Street in Hamtramck with $4,000 and a new identity and 2 alpha heirs growing beneath her heart, allowed herself the ghost of something that was not quite a smile. It would do. For now, it would do. But the Detroit winter was long, and she had time, and she had always been patient in the ways that mattered. She closed her eyes. And somewhere across the city, in the high tower of Blackstone where the lights still burned past midnight, a king sat in his throne room with a crystal glass he hadn't touched and looked at the Detroit River and felt, for the first time since making the decision that had seemed so clean and so rational and so strategically sound in the abstract, the specific weight of what he had actually done. He did not know why. He told himself it was adjustment, the bond reorienting, the emotional aftermath of a major public ceremony. He told himself this for 11 more days before he stopped believing it. And by then, Mary was gone so completely that even the city had forgotten her footprints. 7 months is a long time to disappear. It is also, Mary discovered, exactly long enough to become someone else. Not in the fraudulent sense, not the performed, self-conscious reinvention of someone trying on a new identity, like a costume they keep checking in mirrors. Something more fundamental than that. Something that happened in the bone and the blood and the slow, cellular accumulation of days spent building a life that had no predecessor, no template, no map drawn by anyone who had walked this specific road before. Nora Ellison got a job at a small independent bakery on Jos Compow Avenue in Hamtramck, a place called Starling's, run by a round-faced Polish-American woman named Bet who asked no questions about references, paid in cash every Friday, and maintained a comprehensive personal policy of minding her own business that Mary found, after the suffocating visibility of packed society, to be one of the most profound acts of kindness she had ever encountered. The work was physical and rhythmic and demanded a kind of attention that left no room for spiraling, flour weights and proofing times and the specific, unforgiving logic of bread, which rose or didn't rise based entirely on what you had actually done and not on what you had intended or hoped or believed you deserved. Mary was good at it. She had always been good at practical things, competent in the quiet, unglamorous ways that tend not to get noticed in rooms full of people performing louder versions of competence. Within 3 weeks, Bet had given her the morning shift keys and stopped checking her counts. She kept her head down. She wore her hair differently. Not disguise exactly, just the natural consequence of not having access to the salon she'd used her whole adult life, of letting it grow and pulling it back in ways that changed the shape of her face. She dressed for warmth and utility rather than the careful social presentation of a woman embedded in pack hierarchy. She ate consistently, the way Dr. Adiz had ordered, and she slept when she could, and she went to her prenatal appointments at a small women's clinic in Highland Park, where the attending physician was a human OB who knew nothing about wolf bloodlines and had no idea that her patient's twins were registering on the ultrasound with an unusual density of tissue that she attributed to measurement variance and noted in the file as within acceptable range. The twins grew. They were from very early on distinct and identifiable, not just on the ultrasound screen, but in the way they moved, the way they made their presences known. The one on the left was relentless, constant motion, a rolling energy that reminded Mary so viscerally of Spencer at 22 that she sometimes had to breathe through it carefully. The one on the right was stiller, more deliberate, his movements arriving in focused bursts rather than constant turbulence. She thought of them, privately and without telling anyone, as Storm and Stone. She did not name them yet. Naming felt like a declaration she wasn't ready to make until they were safely in the world. Irina left her alone in the ways that mattered and was present in the ways that counted. There was always food in the kitchen during Mary's designated hours. More food than could be explained by Irina's own modest appetite, quietly supplemented in ways the older woman never acknowledged. On the coldest nights, Mary would come downstairs to find the kitchen warm and a pot of something substantial on the stove and a note on the counter that said only eat in Irina's angular handwriting. She did not make a production of it. Mary loved her for it with a fierceness that surprised her. Cora checked in every 2 weeks by a method that involved a specific arrangement of items in the salvage shop window on the main road. A system so low-tech and so human that no pack surveillance algorithm would ever flag it. 3 times in those 7 months, Mary received packages through Cora's network, additional funds, a second set of documentation that extended her cover identity, and once, in the 6th month, a handwritten note in Cora's precise, economical script that said only, "They are looking. Not finding. Stay steady." Mary read the note twice, burned it in the kitchen sink, and went back to her proofing dough. She had been at Irina's house for exactly 214 days when her water broke. It was 3:17 in the morning on a Thursday in late August, and she was alone in the back bedroom, and she was for approximately 90 seconds, more frightened than she had ever been in her life. A specific, focused terror that had nothing to do with Vivian or Spencer or pack politics, and everything to do with the raw biological reality of what was about to happen. She was 31 years old, and she was about to deliver twin alpha heirs in a safe house in Hamtramck, with no mate bond to buffer the process, and no family present, and the nearest person who knew the full truth of her situation sleeping upstairs. She knocked on Irina's door. Irina opened it in 4 seconds, fully awake, wearing a housecoat and the expression of someone who had been half expecting this knock for weeks. She took one look at Mary and said, "I'll call Adiz. Go sit on the plastic chair in the kitchen." "The plastic chair. I put it there 3 weeks ago." "Go." Dr. Adiz arrived in 19 minutes with a bag that contained everything required for an off-grid birth and the focused, unhurried competence of a woman who had delivered pack pups in conditions ranging from hospital suites to the back seats of cars during border evacuations. She examined Mary with brisk efficiency, announced that things were progressing well and that they had time, and then settled in for the long work of waiting with the patience of someone to whom waiting was a professional skill. The labor was long. It was not, Mary would think later, the worst thing she had ever experienced. That distinction belonged to standing in Blackstone Cathedral watching Spencer extend his hand. But it was the most physically demanding, the most isolating, and paradoxically the most clarifying. There was something about the absolute, consuming physicality of it that stripped everything else away. Pack politics and betrayal and disappeared futures became, for those hours, simply irrelevant. There was only the body doing its ancient, enormous work, and the 2 lives insisting on their arrival. Storm came first, at 6:42 in the morning. Fast and furious and already making noise, his cry cutting through the quiet house like a blade. He was placed on Mary's chest, and she felt, in that moment, something she had no existing vocabulary for. The word love was inadequate. It was more like recognition, the wolf-deep, bone-certain identification of something that had always been hers. Stone arrived 17 minutes later, quieter in his entrance, his dark eyes open and alert from the first second in a way that made Dr. Adiz pause and look at him with an expression that she quickly neutralized back to professional. He was placed beside his brother and he turned his head. Deliberately, Mary would swear it was deliberately, and the two of them oriented toward each other with the magnetic certainty of things that had shared a world for 9 months and intended to continue doing so. Mary held them both. She held them while the August morning brightened against the curtained window and Hamtramck began its day outside, the bakeries and the churches and the close-packed neighborhood coming alive with the sounds of ordinary human life. She held them, and she said their names aloud for the first time. Callum, she said to the one on the left. Storm, still squirming, still furious, already trying to lift his head. And Rhys, Stone, watching her with those unsettling dark eyes. Callum Harrison and Rhys Harrison, though she would not use that surname in any document and would not speak it aloud again for a very long time. She held them, and she allowed herself, for the length of one long exhale, to wish fiercely and completely that things had been different. Then she set the wish down and looked at her sons' faces and got back to the work of surviving. 3 weeks later, in the Tower of Blackstone, Spencer Harrison had not slept properly in 4 months. This was not, on the surface, obvious. He functioned. He governed. He sat through the interminable council sessions and the border dispute mediations and the quarterly tribute negotiations with the northern pacts with the same controlled attention he brought to everything. The face of a king who had everything in hand, whose decisions were sound, whose territory was stable, and whose reign was, by every measurable metric, a success. The measurable metrics had stopped meaning much to him around month 2. He had told himself, in the beginning, that what he felt was adjustment. The emotional recalibration that followed a major life transition, the bond reorienting to Vivian, the normal turbulence of a new partnership establishing its footing. He had told himself this with the same methodical precision he applied to every other problem, building the argument in careful logical steps. The bond was young. The choosing had been politically necessary. Mary had understood the realities of pack politics, even if she had not been explicitly told. That particular argument had stopped holding weight somewhere around week 3, when he had been walking through Eastern Market on a security sweep and caught, for one arrested second, the ghost of a scent that was not there. Auburn hair and green velvet and the warm, anchoring certainty of a presence that had been the fixed point of his interior landscape for 7 years. And the absence of it had hit him in the chest with a force that had nothing to do with political calculation and everything to do with what he had actually done. He had stood in the middle of Eastern Market for a long, exposed moment, surrounded by his security detail, who had the professionalism not to look at his face. And he had understood something he had been refusing to understand. He had made a catastrophic mistake. Not strategically. The alliance was holding. The northern pacts had quieted. The river lords had come to the table. By every external measure, Vivian's assessment had been correct and his decision had been sound. But he had made a catastrophic mistake, and the mistake had a name, and the name was Mary, and she had walked out of Blackstone Cathedral into the Detroit winter 8 weeks before, and no one in his entire intelligence apparatus, the most sophisticated pack surveillance network between Detroit and Toronto, had been able to find a single trace of her since. This bothered him in ways he was not prepared to examine. He had initiated the search quietly, through channels that didn't report to Vivian, framing it as a routine welfare check on a pack member who had gone off-grid. His head enforcer, a former military wolf named Grant Cole who had served the Harrison pack for 15 years and maintained a comprehensive personal policy of not asking his king to explain himself, had taken the assignment without comment and pursued it with the systematic thoroughness that made him the best in the territory. Grant had found nothing. In 4 months of searching, he had found a withdrawal from Mary's bank account in the first week. $600, taken from an ATM on Gresham Avenue, and then nothing. No further financial activity. No phone signal. No pack scent trail after the first 72 hours, when Detroit's weather had scrubbed the streets clean. No social media, no employment records, no medical records, no anything. She had vanished with a competence that impressed Grant, who was not easily impressed, and that disturbed Spencer in a specific, particular way. Because Mary Craig was not, to his knowledge, a woman trained in disappearing. Which meant someone had helped her. Which meant she had resources and contacts he hadn't known about. Which meant she had been preparing for a possibility she had never mentioned to him. He sat with that knowledge and let it reshape his understanding of her, and what it showed him was a woman more capable and more clear-eyed than the story he had been telling himself about her. The story in which she had been a passive recipient of his choices, a casualty of his calculation. She had known on some level. She had prepared. And she had executed her exit with a precision that made his elaborate security apparatus look clumsy. He found, to his own surprise, that this made him feel something that was not grief and not guilt, but something adjacent to both. A complicated, painful pride in her that he had no right to feel and could not stop feeling. The intelligence package arrived on a Thursday morning in late August. Grant brought it personally, which he only did when the content was either urgent, sensitive, or both. He set a sealed envelope on Spencer's desk and stood back with the expression of a man who has done his job and is now waiting to find out what his king intends to do with the results. Spencer broke the seal. Inside was a single photograph and a handwritten note in Grant's economical field shorthand. The photograph had been taken from a distance. Long lens, grainy in the way of surveillance photography conducted without the subject's knowledge, in what appeared to be a residential neighborhood. A woman on a front porch in the early morning, holding 2 infants. Her hair was different. Her clothing was different. She was thinner in some ways and larger in others, changed by the 7 months in a dozen small ways that added up to a face he almost didn't recognize. Almost. He recognized her. He recognized her in the same way he had recognized her scent in Eastern Market. Below the level of thought, in the part of him that was still wolf beneath all the king. In the deep register that didn't care about political calculations and alliance structures, and the perfectly strategic choice he had made in a cathedral in December. He looked at the infants in her arms for a long time. Then he read Grant's note. 2 boys. Delivered approximately 3 weeks ago off-grid. Healer attendance, no hospital records. Sent confirmation required in person, but preliminary assessment, alpha-blooded. Likely your bloodline. Spencer set the note down on his desk with the deliberate steadiness of a man who is concentrating very hard on not letting his hands shake. 2 boys. Alpha-blooded. His blooded. The mathematics of it were simple, and they were brutal. 8 weeks pregnant at the ceremony. He had not known. She had been going to tell him. He understood this suddenly with the absolute certainty of someone assembling a picture that had always been visible, but which he had been refusing to look at directly. She had been going to tell him the night before the ceremony. And Vivian had visited him that same afternoon. And by evening, the decision was made. And Mary, standing in the cathedral the next morning with the knowledge of his children already growing inside her, and the bond between them in the process of being ceremonially severed, had touched her stomach once in that small, involuntary gesture that he had not understood at the time and understood now with a clarity that felt like a physical blow. She had been protecting them. From the moment she walked out of the cathedral, she had been protecting his sons from the political reality that they represented. The destabilizing existence of alpha heirs outside the recognized succession, the threat they posed to Vivian's position, the danger that a calculating queen who had maneuvered her way to the throne over her own sister's body would move swiftly and completely to neutralize. She had disappeared to keep them alive. He stood up from his desk. The room was very quiet. Outside the tower windows, Detroit sprawled gray and late summer hazy to every horizon, the river catching the morning light in long silver strips, the city going about its enormous ordinary business below him. He picked up the photograph again and looked at Mary's face. The changed hair, the different clothes, the careful watchfulness in the set of her shoulders, even in what appeared to be a private moment. A woman who had been living for 7 months with the constant low-level readiness of someone who expected to be found and had structured her entire existence around the contingency. He had done that to her. With his calculation and his silence and his willingness to trade the most real thing in his life for a set of political advantages that now seemed, in the face of this photograph, to be written in a language he no longer entirely understood. He set the photograph down. He looked at Grant with the eyes of a man who has arrived, finally and completely, and without any remaining room for self-deception, at the full understanding of what he has done and what it has cost. "Find her," he said. His voice was steady. It cost him something to make it steady. "Find Mary. Find my sons." Grant nodded once. He was already moving toward the door. "And Vivian?" he asked, without turning around. The question was careful, professionally inflected, stripped of any suggestion of what the answer might mean. Spencer was quiet for a moment. Outside the tower windows, the Detroit River moved gray and indifferent through the late August morning, carrying whatever the city had given it, as it always had, as it always would. Leave her to me, he said. Grant left. Spencer stood at the window for a long time after the door closed. He thought about a girl in Eastern Market at 17, laughing until the stars came out. He thought about a hand found in the dark on the worst night of his life. He thought about 7 years of loving something quietly and privately and without proclamation, as though love were a vulnerability to be kept from enemies, and how that same instinct, that same guarded, calculating silence, had cost him everything it was supposed to protect. He thought about a woman on a front porch in Hamtramck holding 2 small lives who had his blood and her courage, and who had been surviving alone for 7 months because he had not been the man she deserved. He was going to fix this. He did not yet know the full shape of what fixing it would require, or what it would cost, or whether Mary, who had vanished with a competence that had defeated his entire intelligence apparatus, and who had every reason in the world to want nothing to do with him, would allow him anywhere near the attempt. But he was going to try. He was at least going to try. Grant Cole found her on a Tuesday. Not through surveillance technology or pack network intelligence or any of the sophisticated tracking apparatus that the Harrison pack maintained across the Great Lakes territory. He found her because he was at his core a wolf who understood other wolves, who understood that people under sustained pressure fall back on the things that made them feel safe before the pressure began, and that Mary Craig had grown up in Eastern Market, and that Eastern Market on a Tuesday morning in September smelled like bread. He had been walking the market stalls for the 3rd time in 2 weeks when he caught it. Not her scent exactly, which 7 months of careful living in a different neighborhood had overlaid with new textures and new dailiness, but something underneath it. Something older. The specific, warm yeast and autumn signature of a woman who had been handling bread dough for long enough that it had become part of her. He followed it 4 blocks west to a bakery on Jos Compow Avenue with a hand-painted sign that said Starlings and a small chalkboard in the window listing the day's offerings. He did not go inside. He stood on the opposite sidewalk for a moment, confirming what his instincts were already telling him, and then he walked back to his car and called Spencer. "I found her," he said. "She's safe. She's working. The boys are with her." The silence on the other end of the line lasted exactly 4 seconds. "Don't approach her," Spencer said. "Don't let her know she's been found. I'm coming myself." Grant opened his mouth to raise the professional objection. The security concerns, the protocol issues, the fundamental operational wisdom of not sending the Alpha King into a civilian neighborhood without preparation, and then closed it again. He had served Spencer Harrison for 15 years. He knew the difference between the situations where the professional objection would land and the situations where it would not. "I'll send you the address," he said. Spencer arrived in Hamtramck 2 hours later in an unmarked car with a single security detail who had standing orders to maintain a 2-block perimeter and under no circumstances to interfere. He had not told Vivian where he was going. He had told his counsel he had a private diplomatic matter requiring personal attention, which was true in every way that counted and accurate in none of the ways they would have assumed. He sat in the parked car across from Starling's Bakery for 6 minutes before he went in. He needed the 6 minutes. He needed them because the woman he could see through the bakery window, moving between the display counter and the back room with the efficient, unhurried rhythm of someone who had built competence in this space over months, was both completely Mary and someone he did not entirely recognize, and the gap between those two things required a moment to absorb. She had cut her hair. Not dramatically, not in the aggressive way of someone making a statement, but practical inches that changed the shape of her face and made her look, in combination with the flour-dusted apron and the absence of everything that had previously marked her as a woman embedded in pack hierarchy, like someone who had been living an entirely different life. Which she had been, which was, he understood, entirely his fault. He got out of the car and went inside. The bakery smelled of cardamom and warm bread and the particular sweetness of something with honey just out of the oven. There were 4 customers. 2 elderly men sharing a table near the window, a young woman with a laptop, a mother with a toddler at the display case, and a woman behind the counter with auburn hair and a flour-dusted apron who was describing the difference between 2 types of rye bread to the mother with a patience and warmth that stopped Spencer completely in the doorway. She had not looked up yet. He had perhaps 3 seconds. He used them to look at her face and feel, without flinching from it, the full weight of what his silence had cost her. The competence she wore now was not the competence of someone who had chosen this life. It was the competence of someone who had built it from nothing because they had no other option. And there was a difference, and he could see it in the set of her shoulders and the particular quality of her carefulness, and it sat in his chest like a stone. Then she looked up. The moment Mary Craig saw Spencer Harrison standing in the doorway of Starling's bakery, three things happened in very rapid succession. The first was that her wolf sense, the deep biological recognition that had not cared about ceremonies or political calculations or 7 months of deliberate distance, responded to his presence with the same involuntary, humiliating certainty it always had. There he is. The pull of him, unchanged, undiminished by everything that had happened between December and now, moving through her like a current she could not switch off and had stopped pretending she could. The second was that her rational mind snapped into absolute, crystalline focus. Threat assessment, exit routes. The boys at Irina's house 3 blocks away with the emergency protocol they had rehearsed, the burner phone in her apron pocket, the door to the back room 4 steps behind her. The third was rage. Clean, cold, and entirely justified. She held all 3 of these things at once and did not move a single visible muscle. The mother at the display case was still talking. Mary turned back to her with the automatic courtesy of someone who did not let the internal state bleed into the external, completed the transaction, bagged the bread, said have a good morning in a voice that did not shake, and waited until the woman and her toddler had moved away from the counter. Then she looked at Spencer directly. "We're closed," she said. The 2 elderly men at the window table did not look up from their conversation. The young woman with the laptop had headphones on. The bakery continued its quiet morning business around them, oblivious. Spencer stepped forward to the counter. He was not in ceremonial blacks today. Civilian clothes, dark jacket, the deliberate understatement of a man who had come here as himself rather than as a king. It did not make him less recognizable to her. It did not make anything easier. "Mary," he said. "That's not my name," she said. "My name is Nora Ellison. I have identification. I have an employment record. And I would like you to leave my place of work before I am forced to make a scene in front of customers that will complicate both our situations significantly. I'm not here as the Alpha King. I know exactly how you're here," she said. "You're here because someone in your apparatus found me, and you decided to come personally rather than send enforcers, which tells me you want to manage this quietly, which means you already understand that what you did is not manageable loudly." She kept her voice level and low, the register of a woman having an ordinary conversation that happened to contain extraordinary content. "So yes, you found me. You know I'm alive. You can file that information wherever it needs to go, and then you can leave. I know about Callum and Reese." The names in his mouth stopped her. She had not told anyone their names outside the immediate circle of Cora's network. She looked at him and recalculated, and the recalculation made her hands, below the counter where he couldn't see them, press flat against her thighs. "Then you know," she said carefully, "that they are safe, and that they're going to stay safe, and that the best thing you can do for their safety is walk back out that door and return to your tower and your queen and your stable, bloodless territory and forget that this conversation happened. I'm not going to do that. Spencer." "I didn't know." His voice had changed. Something had gone out of the controlled register, not cracking exactly, but losing its smooth administrative surface, showing the rougher material beneath. "About the pregnancy. I need you to know that I didn't know." "I know you didn't know," she said. "I was going to tell you the night before. But Vivian visited you that afternoon, and by the time I arrived at the cathedral the next morning, the decision was already written on her face." She paused. "Which means she knew. Which means she moved when she did because she suspected, or because she'd had me watched, and she needed to secure your commitment before I had the chance to change the calculation." Spencer was very still. "I came to that conclusion myself," he said quietly. "It took me longer than it should have." "Yes," she said. "It did." The acknowledgement landed between them without softening. She had not intended to soften it. Bet came out of the back room at that moment with a tray of something that needed to go in the display case, took one look at the atmosphere at her counter, and retreated back through the door with the magnificent, incurious efficiency of a woman who had built 11 years of successful business on the policy of minding her own affairs. The door swung shut behind her. The 2 old men continued their conversation. The woman with the laptop typed. "I need to see them," Spencer said. "No. Mary." Nora. She said it quietly but precisely. In this building, in this neighborhood, in this life, my name is Nora. And the answer is no. Not today. Not like this. They're my sons. They are my sons, she said, who I have kept alive for 7 months in a safe house in a city that would have used them as political leverage the moment your queen learned they existed. They are my sons, and I will not produce them on demand because you drove 2 hours in an unmarked car and said please. She stopped, breathed. I understand why you're here. I understand that you have rights in this situation that I cannot simply dismiss. But you do not get to show up at my place of work with no warning and expect me to hand you access to 2 infants because the timing is suddenly convenient for you. The silence that followed was long and genuine. He absorbed what she had said without deflecting it, without the automatic managerial instinct to manage the problem. And she watched him do it and felt, against her will, the particular complicated ache of recognizing the person she had loved in the face of the person who had hurt her. You're right, he said. She had not entirely expected that. I know I'm right, she said, slightly less steadily than she intended. I want to explain. I know the explanation. She turned away from him briefly, made an unnecessary adjustment to the display case, turned back. Vivian made you a political argument. The northern Pax, the river lords, the eastern border. It was a sound argument. You are a king who prioritizes his territory's stability, and you made a sound strategic decision. And you did not tell me because telling me would have required you to have a conversation you did not want to have, and because some part of you believed, or wanted to believe, that I would understand the realities of pack politics well enough to absorb it without being told. She met his eyes. How am I doing so far? Something moved through his expression that was beyond what she had vocabulary for. Accurate, he said. To the point of being, yes, accurate. I have had 7 months and a great deal of bread making to think it through, she said, and despite everything, despite the rage and the grief and the cold Hamtramck morning and the 2 small lives 3 blocks away who would never understand what had been decided over their heads before they were born, despite all of it, something at the edge of her voice came dangerously close to the ghost of something dry and almost familiar. Spencer's jaw tightened. He looked at his hands on the counter, then back at her face. I am going to ask you something, he said. And I want you to answer it honestly even if the honest answer is the worst thing you've said to me today. She waited. Are you safe here? Right now, in this life, are you and the boys genuinely safe? Or is the safety contingent on me walking back out that door and maintaining the fiction that I don't know where you are? She considered this. It was, she recognized, a question that stripped away everything except the thing that actually mattered, and it deserved the honest answer he'd asked for. For now, she said. Contingent on several things remaining stable. Vivian has not found us. Cora's network has held. But, she paused. But I am one piece of information away from the contingency failing. If Vivian learns about the boys, through your network, through a leak, through any of the dozen ways that information travels in Pax society, the safe house protocol is not sufficient. I have an exit plan. It involves Windsor and a contact across the river. But taking 2 infants across an international border on emergency documentation has its own category of risks. Spencer listened to all of this without interrupting. When she finished, he said, I can make you safe. Properly, permanently safe. Not contingent on anything. I know you can, she said. The question is what the price is. No price, he said immediately. Spencer. She said his name, his actual name, not the title, not the managed distance of the Alpha King, for the first time that morning, and something about the way it came out made them both very still. There is always a price in pack politics. You taught me that. Everything is a negotiation. Everything has terms. Then here are my terms, he said. I want to see my sons. I want to know them. I want them to carry their name, their real name, without hiding. He held her eyes. And I want the opportunity to spend whatever time you require demonstrating that I understand what I did wrong. Not managing it. Not explaining it away. Actually understanding it. And accepting whatever verdict you arrive at on the other side of that time. The bakery continued its quiet morning around them. Outside on Joss Compow, a delivery truck rumbled past. Somewhere in the back room, Bet was doing something with a mixer that she was very obviously running louder than necessary. Mary looked at him for a long time. She looked at the face she had known since she was 17 and the eyes that had always, when they stopped performing for the pack, looked at her like she was the only fixed point in a room full of variables. She looked at him and she felt the full, complicated truth of loving someone who had failed her, and knowing that the failure had been real and the love had also been real, and that neither of those facts canceled the other. "I need time," she said finally. "Not today. Not this week. I need arrangements. I need assurances about Vivian that are structural, not verbal. Name them," he said. "Whatever they are. Name them." She looked at him for another long moment. "Come back Thursday," she said. "Alone. Not to the bakery. I'll leave an address with Cora's network. You know about Cora, I assume." Grant identified the connection. "We haven't. Don't touch Cora's network," she said, with a sharpness that was not a request. "Those people exist because pack society failed them. You leave that network intact, and you leave Cora's people alone. That is the first term." "Agreed," he said without hesitation. "Thursday," she said. "And Spencer," she held his eyes. "Come as yourself. Not as the king. The king has done enough." He nodded. Something in his expression shifted. Not the fracture she remembered from childhood. Not exactly, but something in the same family as that. Something unguarded and real and very tired. He left. Mary stood at the counter and did not watch him go. She heard the door, heard the bell above it, heard the sound of the street reclaim the space he had occupied. She stood very still for a moment, her hands flat on the counter, breathing through her nose in the way he had taught her in a different lifetime. Then Bet came out of the back room, set a cup of coffee on the counter next to Mary's elbow, and said, without looking at her, "Whatever that was, it looked like it needed coffee." Mary looked at the coffee. She picked it up. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Bet said, already heading back to the kitchen. "Just make sure the sourdough gets shaped before noon." That night, Mary sat in the back bedroom with Callum on one side and Reese on the other, their warm, breathing weight bracketing her in the dark, and she let herself think about Thursday. She thought about terms and structures and the specific, complex architecture of a situation that had no clean resolution. Only a set of possible futures, each with their own costs, each requiring her to decide what she was willing to carry and what she was not. She thought about her sons' faces and the things she recognized in them that she had been carefully not naming for 3 weeks since their birth. She thought about what it meant to raise alpha heirs in a city that didn't know their names, and what it would cost them to spend their lives as Callum and Reese Ellison instead of what they were. She thought about Vivian. This was the part she had not yet said to Spencer, because Thursday had not yet happened, and some things needed to be said in the right order. Vivian was not simply a political inconvenience. Vivian was a woman who had demonstrated, with calm and comprehensive efficiency, that she was willing to destroy her own sister's life in service of her ambitions. That woman was now the Luna of the Great Lakes territory. She had access to Spencer's intelligence apparatus, his enforcer network, his counsel. She had 3 months before Spencer's discovery to potentially position assets and contingencies that Mary did not yet know the shape of. The safe house protocol was not sufficient. Mary had told Spencer this honestly. What she had not told him was that she had known it was not sufficient for approximately 6 weeks. Had known it since the 3rd time Cora's window signal had read "they are looking," and the geographic radius of the looking had been getting smaller. She had been preparing the Windsor option. She had not wanted the Windsor option. Taking her sons across the river meant leaving the city that had sheltered her, the network that had protected her, the woman upstairs who left eat notes on the kitchen counter and had never once asked a single question. But she had been preparing it. Now perhaps she did not have to use it. She pressed her lips to the top of Callum's head. He made a sound of absolute, imperial displeasure at being disturbed, and then subsided back into the oceanic sleep of a well-fed infant. Reese, on her other side, did not stir. He slept the way he did everything, with a total, focused commitment to the thing he was doing. "Who are you going to be?" she thought, looking at them in the dark. "What are you going to cost me? And what are you going to give back? And who in God's name are you going to become?" She did not have answers. She had only the questions and the dark and the sound of Hamtramck breathing outside the window, and the particular, terrifying, irreversible love of a mother who has decided that her children's future is worth whatever it costs her to secure it. Thursday, she thought. Let's see who you are on Thursday, Spencer Harrison, when there's no cathedral and no ceremony and no political calculation. Let's see who you are when it's just you and the consequences of everything you chose. Let's see if you're the man I loved, or only ever the king. Spencer came on Thursday. He came alone, as she had asked. No security detail, no enforcer, no unmarked car idling at the curb with a wolf behind the wheel running threat assessments on the neighborhood. He came in a plain dark jacket and worn boots and the particular stripped-down quality of a man who has left every layer of performance at home. No sigil, no ceremonial anything, nothing that said king except the way he carried himself, which was not something he could leave behind because it had been built into him over too many years to be removed by clothing choices. Mary had left the address with Cora's network as promised. A coffee shop 3 blocks from Irina's house, neutral ground, public enough to prevent anything from escalating, private enough in its back corner booth that a conversation could be had without an audience. She was already there when he arrived, seated with her back to the wall in the way she had learned to sit over 7 months of living carefully, a habit that had become so automatic she no longer noticed it until she saw Spencer clock at the moment he walked in and understood what it meant. She watched him understand it. She watched the understanding move through his expression and settle somewhere that looked like it would stay. He sat down across from her. A server came. They ordered coffee they both needed and neither of them tasted. Then Mary opened the folder she had brought. The folder contained 4 things. The first was a document prepared by a lawyer in Cora's network, a woman named Adira Mensah who specialized in pack-adjacent legal structures and who had spent 2 days constructing what she described, with professional understatement, as a framework of protections. It established, in language that would survive both human legal scrutiny and PAC tribunal review, the independent status of Callum and Rhys Harrison as heirs of the Alpha King's bloodline, with all rights, protections, and succession claims attendant to that status. It also established Mary's parental authority as primary and unconditional, not subject to override by PAC hierarchy, territorial authority, or Luna's decree. That last clause was the one that mattered. Spencer read it without expression. When he reached the Luna's decree provision, he was still for a moment. Then he picked up the pen Mary had set beside the folder and signed it. No negotiation. No counter-proposal. He signed it and set the pen down and looked at her. Next, he said. The second document was simpler. A formal renunciation of any claim by the Alpha King's household to relocate, separate, or make decisions regarding the Harrison heirs without the explicit written consent of their mother. It was, in PAC legal terms, an extraordinary concession. It effectively removed Vivian from any position of authority over the boys entirely. He signed this one faster. The third item in the folder was not a document. It was a photograph, taken 3 weeks ago, the morning after the births, Callum and Rhys asleep together in the way they slept, turned toward each other, their small faces carrying the specific, undeniable gravity of new lives that had arrived with their own complete and serious intentions. Spencer looked at this photograph for a long time. He did not speak. Mary did not fill the silence. She let him have it because it was his to have. The first real sight of his son's faces, the knowledge arriving not as intelligence report or surveillance photograph, but as this. 2 sleeping boys in an August morning, entirely themselves, entirely unaware of the complicated world they had been born into. When he looked up, his eyes were not entirely steady. Callum and Rhys, he said. She had included the names in the briefing note. Yes. Who? He stopped. Cleared his throat. Who do they? Callum is you at 22, she said, because there was no point being oblique about it. Constant motion. Furious about everything. Already trying to be in charge of situations he is too small to be in charge of. Something moved through her voice that was not quite a smile, but was in the same family. Rhys is, I don't know yet. He watches. He's very deliberate. He'll tell us who he is when he decides we're ready to know. Spencer looked at the photograph again. Then he set it down carefully, as though it were something that could be damaged by handling. Can I meet them today? He asked. The question was quiet and stripped of everything except the actual thing it was asking. Mary looked at him across the table. She thought about Thursday, about who he was on Thursday, when there was no ceremony and no calculation and no political architecture to hide behind. She had been watching him since he walked in the door, measuring him against the question she had asked herself in the dark 3 nights ago. Let's see if you're the man I loved, or only ever the king. He had signed both documents without negotiation. He had looked at his son's photograph with eyes that told her everything she needed to know about the gap between what he had calculated in December and what he understood now. He had come alone, and he had come as himself, and he had not, at any point in the past 40 minutes, attempted to manage her. Yes, she said. This afternoon. The fourth item in the folder was the one she had not shown him yet. She slid it across the table after he looked up from the photograph. It was a document of a different kind, not legal protections or parental agreements, but an intelligence brief. Compiled over the past 3 weeks from sources within Cora's network who had maintained careful, quiet surveillance of Vivian Craig Harrison's activities since the choosing ceremony. Sources inside the PAC administrative structure. Sources in the council chambers. Sources in the household staff of Blackstone Tower itself, because Cora's network reached places that Spencer's official apparatus did not, precisely because it was built by people his official apparatus had failed. Spencer read it with the focused, rapid attention of a man accustomed to intelligence documents. Mary watched his face as he read. She watched it change. The brief documented, among other things, Vivian's instruction to a household enforcer in week 3 post-ceremony to locate and assess the Craig woman's situation. Phrasing that, in PAC enforcer language, was a formal directive to surveil with prejudice. An intercepted communication in month 4 between Vivian and a contact in the Northern PAC territory that referenced the succession complication in terms suggesting she was aware of or strongly suspected the pregnancy. A financial transaction in month 6, routed through 3 intermediary accounts but traceable by Cora's network's forensic accountant, to a freelance enforcer with a documented history of problem resolution that had nothing to do with diplomacy. And most damningly, a conversation, recorded in Blackstone Tower's private residential corridor by a source Mary was not going to identify, in which Vivian had said to her personal assistant, speaking with the calm, organized efficiency of someone discussing a logistics problem, that if the Craig situation surfaces before the end of the year, it needs to be managed at the source. Managed at the source. Spencer set the brief down. He was very still. Mary had seen him angry before, during the consolidation years, when rival PAC lords had pushed beyond the boundaries of acceptable provocation. She had seen the cold, controlled fury that was his particular version of rage. It was nothing like hot anger. It was quieter and more total and significantly more dangerous. The anger of a man who had learned to keep everything that mattered behind walls and who, when something breached those walls, became absolutely and completely focused on the single objective of ensuring it never happened again. He was that now. The stillness of him was not calm. It was the stillness of something that had made a decision so complete that all the energy that would otherwise go into deliberation was now entirely available for execution. "How long have you had this?" he asked. "The full picture for 3 weeks. The earlier piece is longer. You didn't send it to me." "I didn't trust your apparatus not to route information back to her," Mary said. "I don't know the full shape of what she's built inside your structure. I don't know who reports to her that you don't know about. Until I knew you were coming yourself, I wasn't going to risk it." He absorbed this. He did not argue with it. "I need the source protection agreements before I act on any of this," he said. "The people inside the tower who gave you this information, they need ironclad protections before I move." "Adira has the documentation ready," Mary said. "Cora's people don't surface without structural guarantees. That's non-negotiable." "Agreed." He said it immediately, without the brief pause of a man calculating. "I'll have Grant coordinate with your lawyer today." He looked at the brief again. Then at her. "Mary, what she authorized, the freelance enforcer. I know. If he had found you before." "I know," she said again more quietly. "I think about it. I've been thinking about it for 6 weeks since we identified the transaction. She stopped. The rage was there, under the surface of her composure, the deep, specific fury of a mother who has understood precisely how close the line came. "It's one of the reasons the Windsor option was on the table. And one of the reasons I needed structural protections before I agreed to anything today." Spencer was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the particular, carefully controlled quality of someone saying something enormous in a small space. "I am sorry," he said. "I want to say that clearly, without qualification, and without the caveat of explanation. What I did in December, the decision itself, and the silence before it, put you in a situation where you were alone and unprotected and carrying my children, and the woman I chose was using her access to my resources to authorize violence against you. That is," he stopped. The controlled quality of his voice worked hard for a moment. "There is no framing of that which is acceptable. I am sorry." Mary looked at him across the table for a long time. She thought about the woman who had walked into this situation 7 months ago, who had memorized an emergency number and burned a card in a kitchen sink and told herself she would never need it. She thought about Hamtramck in the dark and bread dough and eat notes on kitchen counters and 2 small warm weights on either side of her in the night. She thought about what it had cost her to build a life that was hers, entirely and only hers, without the scaffolding of pack society or the safety net of the bond or anyone's protection except her own intelligence and Cora's network, and an older woman with iron-gray hair who had never asked a single question. She thought about what she was willing to let back in, and at what cost and on what terms. "I know you're sorry," she said finally. "I believe that you're sorry. It matters. It's not sufficient, but it matters." She folded her hands on the table. "I'm not ready to tell you that everything is resolved between us. What happened in December doesn't get resolved in a coffee shop on a Thursday morning. What I can tell you is that the boys deserve to know their father, and that I'm willing to build something, carefully, slowly, on terms that are mine to set, that allows that to happen. That's more than I have any right to ask for," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "It is. So don't waste it." She took him to Irina's house at 2 in the afternoon. Irina opened the door, looked at Spencer Harrison with the measuring, unhurried gaze of a woman who had seen everything and was unimpressed by most of it, and said, "Boots off at the door. The boys are in the back room. Mary knows the way." Spencer took his boots off at the door without a word. Mary led him down the hallway to the back room where Callum and Rhys were arranged in the double bassinet that Irina had produced from somewhere on the second week without comment, as though it had simply materialized through the same quiet magic as the kitchen food and the eat notes. The room was warm and low-lit in the afternoon light, and the sounds coming from the bassinet were the specific, demanding sounds of 2 boys who had recently been fed and were now in the process of filing formal complaints about various atmospheric conditions. Spencer stopped in the doorway. Mary watched him see his sons for the first time. She had tried to prepare herself for this moment, had tried to imagine what it would feel like to watch him receive what she had been carrying alone for all these months, the specific weight of these 2 small, furious, extraordinary lives. She had thought she was prepared. She was not entirely prepared, because what moved through Spencer Harrison's face in the doorway of that back bedroom in Hamtramck was not something she had a name for. Not joy exactly, not relief exactly, not grief exactly, though it contained elements of all 3. It was more fundamental than any of those. It was the expression of a man arriving at something he had not known was missing until this moment revealed the precise shape of the absence. He crossed the room and looked into the bassinet. Callum looked back at him with the furious, imperial suspicion of a small person who reserves the right to be unimpressed by anyone until proven otherwise. Rhys regarded him with those deliberate dark eyes, the watchful assessment of a boy who had been forming opinions since birth, and was now adding this particular data point to his considerable internal file. Spencer reached out one hand, carefully, slowly, giving both boys the chance to register the approach, and Callum immediately grabbed his index finger with both hands and attempted, with tremendous conviction and no success whatsoever, to put it in his mouth. Something happened in Spencer's face that Mary would not be able to describe accurately to anyone afterward. It was not quite a smile. It was something that arrived before smiles, in the place where the decision to perform stops mattering because the thing you are feeling is simply too large to perform. "Hello," he said to his sons. His voice was not steady. He did not appear to care. Rhys watched him. Callum maintained his determined assault on the finger. Mary stood in the doorway and felt the complicated, aching wholeness of a moment that was not a resolution. Because none of this was resolved, because December still stood between them and Thursday's signed documents were a beginning not an ending, and there was still Vivian, and there was still the long, uncertain work of building something new from the wreckage of what had been broken, but which was nonetheless real. True. The kind of moment that anchors everything that comes after it. She let it be what it was. Vivian's reckoning came 12 days later. Spencer moved with the precision and thoroughness of a man who had spent 3 years consolidating a territory and understood exactly how power structures were assembled and therefore exactly how they were taken apart. He did not move publicly. He did not move loudly. He moved through the same quiet channels that Vivian had used to build her position, through the council members and the enforcer network and the administrative infrastructure of Blackstone Tower. And he moved with the intelligence brief that Cora's network had compiled as his foundation and Adira Mensa's legal architecture as his framework. The source protections went into place first. Every person who had contributed information to the brief received ironclad guarantees before Spencer acted on a single piece of it. This was not negotiated. It was the first thing he did, before anything else, before any move against Vivian was initiated. Mary had not asked him to prioritize it. He had done it without being asked, and she had filed that fact carefully in the place where she was building her revised understanding of who he was and who he was capable of being. The financial transaction, the payment to the freelance enforcer, was the instrument. In PAC law, authorizing violence against an alpha's bloodline was not merely a marital transgression or a political miscalculation. It was treason. Specific, documented, provable treason, the kind that carried consequences that no alliance structure could mitigate and no political leverage could trade away. Spencer presented the evidence to the council in a closed session on a gray October morning. He presented it without editorializing, without the performance of betrayed fury, with the calm and thorough precision of a king who has the facts and intends to let them do their work. The council, which had spent 3 years learning that Spencer Harrison did not bring them incomplete cases, absorbed the evidence in the silence of people who understood what they were looking at and what it meant. Vivian was removed from the position of Luna of the Great Lakes Territory 11 days before the first anniversary of the choosing ceremony. The removal was not loud. It was not the dramatic, public humiliation that PAC gossip would have preferred and that Mary, she admitted to herself honestly, had occasionally imagined in darker moments. It was procedural and documented and final, a legal dissolution under PAC tribunal authority, with terms that included permanent exile from the Great Lakes Territory and a binding restriction on any claim to Harrison bloodline succession or PAC political structure. Vivian left Blackstone Tower on a Tuesday morning in October with 2 suitcases and the specific, composed expression of a woman who has been defeated and knows it and will not, in front of witnesses, allow that defeat to show. Mary was not there. She had no interest in witnessing it and would not have gone if Spencer had asked her to, which he had not. What Mary was doing on that Tuesday morning was feeding Callum and Reese their 7 o'clock breakfast in Irina's kitchen, with the radio on low and the October light coming through the window and Irina at the other end of the table with her coffee and her newspaper, pretending with magnificent and entirely transparent determination to be reading the weather page. Mary's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number that she recognized as one of Grant Cole's disposable lines. "It's done," it said. "She's gone." Mary set the phone face down on the table. She looked at her sons. Callum was conducting his ongoing campaign to get more food than was being offered, and Reese was watching her with those dark, serious eyes that saw too much for a boy who was not yet 2 months old. "It's done," she said aloud, to no one in particular and to both of them specifically. Irina turned a page of her newspaper. What came after was not simple. Mary had not expected it to be simple and would not have trusted it if it had been. Spencer came to Hamtramck 3 times a week, always on the days she designated, always alone. Always on the terms she had established in the coffee shop on Thursday. He sat on Irina's kitchen floor and let Callum use him as furniture and held Reese with the careful, focused attention of a man who understood that this particular boy was assessing him constantly and had standards. He did not push. He did not arrive with agendas or proposals or the pressure of a man accustomed to moving situations toward his preferred outcomes. He arrived and he was present and he let the terms be hers. This was, she recognized, the most significant thing he could have done. Not the signed documents, not Vivian's removal, not the formal restoration of her sons' names. Those were necessary. They were not sufficient. What was slowly, incrementally building the foundation of something new was the sustained, consistent, unglamorous work of showing up on the days she said to show up, and leaving on the days she said to leave, and not asking for more than what she had determined was available. She did not make it easy. She had not decided to make it easy. There were weeks when the grief of what December had taken from her surfaced with a force that made the careful reconstruction feel futile, and she told him so, directly and without softening, because she had spent 7 months building the capacity for that kind of honesty, and she was not going to unlearn it for anyone's comfort, including his. He absorbed it. He did not deflect or explain or manage. He absorbed it, and he came back the next designated day, and the day after that. She noticed. She filed it away in the place she was building. They talked, in those months, in the way that people talk when they have stopped performing for each other. About the years of the consolidation, about the things she had understood and the things she had not, about the night of his father's death and the Eastern market mornings, and the 7 years of loving each other in the guarded, private way of people who have decided that love is a vulnerability to be protected from enemies, and how that same decision had become the mechanism of their own undoing. They talked about Vivian, not with the heat of fresh betrayal, but with the cooler, more complex reckoning of people trying to understand how something had been allowed to happen, what they had each failed to see, where the walls they had both built had served someone else's purposes. Mary did not forgive her sister on any timeline that felt neat or satisfying. The forgiveness, when it began to move in her, and it did begin to move slowly and against her preference, in the stubborn way that forgiveness tends to move when you are too honest with yourself to pretend the damage was done by someone entirely unlike you, was not for Vivian's benefit. It was for her own. It was the recognition that carrying the full weight of that particular betrayal required energy she needed for other things, and that setting it down was not the same as excusing it. She set it down, piece by piece, in her own time and on her own terms. On a Sunday morning in February, 13 months after the choosing ceremony, with Detroit locked in the kind of winter that strips everything down to its essentials, Spencer Harrison arrived at Irina's house with the specific, carefully controlled expression of a man who has something to say and has spent considerable time deciding how to say it. He sat down at the kitchen table. Callum was on his lap immediately, conducting the ongoing campaign for Spencer's watch that had been his primary project for the past 6 weeks. Reese was on the floor nearby, regarding a wooden block with the focused philosophical attention he brought to all objects, as though determining their fundamental nature before committing to an opinion. Irina was, as usual, at the far end of the table with her coffee and her newspaper, maintaining her policy of magnificent, transparent non-interference. Mary sat across from Spencer and waited. "I'm not going to ask you to come back," he said. "I want to be clear about that before I say anything else. What I'm about to say is not contingent on anything. Not on your answer. Not on what you decide. Not on any outcome. What I say next is true regardless of what you do with it." She waited. "I love you," he said. "I loved you when I made the worst decision of my life, and I loved you through every day of the 7 months you were gone, and I love you now. And I understand. I want you to know that I genuinely understand. That love being true does not mean it is sufficient, or that it earns anything, or that it changes what happened. I'm not telling you this as an argument. I'm telling you because I spent 7 years treating love like a vulnerability to hide from enemies, and I think that costs both of us more than I have full accounting for yet, and I am done hiding it. Whatever you decide, whatever comes next, I am done hiding it." The kitchen was very quiet. Callum had gotten the watch off and was examining it with tremendous satisfaction. Reese had set down his block and was watching the adults at the table with the expression of a boy filing significant data. Irina turned a page of her newspaper. Mary looked at Spencer Harrison across Irina's kitchen table. At the face she had known since 17, at the man who had failed her and was attempting, with genuine and sustained effort, to become the man who wouldn't, at the father of her sons who sat on his lap stealing his watch while his brother watched the world with ancient, serious eyes, and she felt the full, complicated, irreducible truth of everything that was true simultaneously. The grief was true. The love was true. The damage was true. The repair that had been happening slowly and unglamorously over these months was true. The boys were true. This kitchen was true. This February morning was true. She had spent 13 months building the capacity for honest things. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "I know," she said. "I know you do." His hand turned under hers and held on. Outside, the Detroit winter pushed against the windows, gray and cold and indifferent in the way of things that have no stake in human outcomes. In the way of rivers and weather and the passage of time, which moves forward regardless, which carries everything the city gives it and keeps moving and does not stop for grief or ceremony or the complicated, necessary, unglamorous work of two people deciding, in a kitchen in Hamtramck on a Sunday morning in February, that what remains after. Everything that has been lost is still, and against considerable odds, and on terms that are entirely new, worth building on. Callum dropped the watch. It clattered on the tile floor. He looked at it, then at Spencer, with an expression of sublime unconcern that said clearly that watches were replaceable, and this moment was not. Rhys picked up his block. He had apparently reached a conclusion about its fundamental nature. He seemed satisfied. Irina turned another page. And in Blackstone Tower across the city, the Alpha King's throne room stood empty on a Sunday morning, because the Alpha King was in a kitchen in Hamtramck with his sons, and the woman who had survived everything and built a life from nothing, and held her terms and kept her sons alive and loved him back, finally, on terms that were entirely her own. Which was, all things considered, exactly where he was supposed to be. And this time he knew it. Mary walked out of that cathedral with nothing but a green dress and 2 heartbeats beneath her heart. And she built everything from the ground up. If that story moved you, hit subscribe so you never miss another tale like this one. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Did Mary forgive too soon or right on time? Like the video, and tap the one on your screen right now to see what unfolds in our next werewolf fantasy. We'll see you there.